You're listening to WCAT Radio, your home for authentic Catholic programming.
I'm Bryan Froehle, who today has the privilege of interviewing Father Alfredo Hernández, who is not only Vice Rector and Academic Dean of St. Vincent de Paul Regional Seminary, Boynton Beach, Florida. Since July 1st, he has also taken on the role of acting rector at the same seminary of St. Vincent de Paul Regional Seminary in Boynton Beach, Florida. Father Hernández is a priest of the Diocese of Palm Beach. He holds a licentiate degree in sacred theology from the Pontifical Gregorian University and a PhD from Northwest University. We're here to discuss a deceptively thin text that is one of the most extraordinary theological contributions on the priesthood in decades. Years ago, I personally remember being greatly moved by Father Lou Camelli, author of a number of key materials on the priesthood, including USCCB documents, former professor at Mundelein Seminary, when he simply insisted that it is theologically problematic to use the phrase priestly life and ministry. And following Roman practice, he rightly insisted on the phrase priestly ministry and life. That very simple ordering says in itself a great deal regarding the sacrament of orders, and indeed sacramental theology in general. So too in this remarkable work by Father Alfredo Hernández. Father Hernández has done something that is also of critical usefulness from a very practical formational standpoint. And that is the direction we will pursue in this conversation. Father Alfredo, in the very start of the text, indeed, in the dedication page, you mentioned two key elements: perseverance in vocational commitment, and you connect it with joyful faithfulness. You mentioned the example of your own parents, and the text itself seems deeply connected to this link between perseverance and vocational commitment and joyful faithfulness. Before we move forward in the interview, I'd like to ask you for a few words on those two concepts and the connection you might wish to make between them.
Well, first of all, it takes work to maintain any commitment. And that's the perseverance. We believe so strongly as Catholic Christians that we make commitments that are lifelong, that it is possible existentially in a world where that denies that possibility in so many ways, that it is possible to say a lifelong yes. And at the same time, that's not supposed to be something that we do hanging on by our fingertips, white knuckling it, as is sometimes used. I've heard that used in seminary formation. I've heard it used about priests. And it's something that is supposed to be life-giving. We hear the Beatitudes are the charter of the Christian life, and although I've never liked the 1970s expression, the Happytudes, we know that one of the translations that is possible of the Greek word that blessed are those, happy are those. And so it is the road to happiness, but it's the road to happiness that is linked to the cross. And so to see those common elements, and again, the dedication is to my parents, and how I've seen in their lives a life that began in Cuba, and they lost everything but gained more, and they never had an attitude of, oh, I would go back because. It's like, okay, what's the life that the Lord has given us here? What's the life He's given to our children, to our grandchildren? And then in my dad's final years, I saw my mom do the things that I would say were sort of like in the fine print of the marriage contract, as she cared for him. And so again, I saw them persevere through good times and bad, and I saw the joy with which they did so, and the joy that they brought to their family and to so many, many friends. And so I saw that in my parents in priesthood, where there is that commitment that is supposed to be lifelong. A basic question that led to this research was, what is it that we can do at seminary? Realizing that there are many other variables, but what is it that we can do in seminary formation to help men prepare to say a yes that's forever, but a yes that is forever that is also going to be joyful for them and for others. Because the guys who are white knuckling it, not only are they going to be miserable, but they're probably going to be making other people miserable too, which is not the point. So again, those are two elements, and I like the way you asked the question, because it certainly brings to mind what was my intention. The research itself was focusing more on the basic question of perseverance, and yet the ways that I was able to ask questions of as we talk about it more, leads as well to what seminary formation activities actually did help guys not only persevere, but also do so in ways that was life-giving. Enjoy.
Father Hernández, I'd like to thank you for the insight that you bring theologically in your work, particularly in the foundational chapter that lays out a theology of perseverance. And as it does so, it's clear that you are connecting it precisely as you describe to joyful faithfulness. And that's clear in your theological review of the understanding of priesthood from the very beginning of the tradition, from the very, very beginning, from the time of Christ, and indeed looking to other models at the very time of Christ, carrying it up throughout history into the present time, and all the various studies of priesthood, as well as the present moment with regard to theology of priesthood. I want to thank you very much for that. Before we move on to take a look at the specific moves you make next in the text, I would simply like to invite you to return to this theologizing about priesthood as you see fit, because the insights you offer are really profound for us today, arguably more than ever. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. And I guess I would call the theologizing in those two, that chapter, that first full chapter, really focuses on the, you'd say, sort of diachronic, looking across history, how has that understanding of perseverance developed? And if there was a golden thread that I would see throughout that whole chapter, going back to why Clement said that bishops shouldn't be deposed without good reason, and going even to the understanding of the development of character, of the sacramental character, that ordination could not be repeated, and the need to make sure that the people could rely on the validity of the celebration of the sacraments, and then going to the understanding of priesthood of Vatican II and theologians after Vatican II. If I'd say that there's a golden thread, it would be the understanding of the good of the people of God. That because there's the danger of understanding perseverance as of a focus on character separated from the people. That this is my honor as priest, and you'd better call me father, or else I'm going to tell you you're wrong. But no, I'm father because I'm called to be a father to the people of God. And even some of the recent theology that focuses specifically on priestly fatherhood. But that but it's always for the good of the people. That my call to be faithful is because I'm called to be faithful in relationship to these people that I'm called to serve. And so it isn't a matter, and I think that's the danger in this kind of conversation of getting into some of the theological battles of the last 50 or 60 years. I really tried to do this research without getting into that and saying it isn't a matter of left or right. It's I need to persevere because the people to whom I'm giving my life need me to. And so, in a nutshell, I might have been able to save a couple years of work on my doctorate if I could just put it in that nutshell. But as I look at the whole process, that's how I would sum up that diachronic historical review of theology.
And for that, I'd like to thank you profoundly, because at some level, you're suggesting that we adjust our focus from a static understanding of orders to a dynamic understanding, one that is always relational to the people of God. And at some level, that's why your focus inevitably needed to be on formation, because it answers the question of formation for what, or rather, formation for whom. And that takes us to the profound vision that animated your work in the first place. And given that we need to carry the conversation forward, as tempted as I would be to explore all these different avenues,
right,
I'd like to move forward to simply lifting up that you have taken a careful look at different elements of formation, specifically that of clinical pastoral education, the spirituality or propaedeutic year, the pastoral year, priestly fraternity groups, and specifically the Institute for Priestly Formation. We'll speak about those specifically as we proceed. But before we do so, I need to bring in the question of method for your work, because I find the question of method, that very robust theological method that you've brought to your work, to be one that also allows for this full accounting of a theology of priesthood, this robust accounting that you're proposing, and in which you will now have a leadership role in particular as acting rector at St. Vincent de Paul Regional Seminary. I'd like to briefly then, very briefly, turn your attention to practical theological method. It's often said that practical theological method grew from the see, judge, act approach of Catholic action of a century ago, under the various Popes Pius, particularly Pope St. Pius X and Pius XI, as well as, of course, ultimately John the 23rd, and finally through the council and the teachings of the magisterium of our day. Later on, we can see how others, even those outside the Catholic tradition, bring in that same method in their work in practical theology, tremendously influenced by the see, judge, act method. And of course, we also know, as you clearly do in your work, the seminal work of that great priest and theologian who passed away just about a year ago, Hans van der Ven, who was not only the president of the European Theological Society, but one of the founders of the International Academy for Practical Theology. You, of course, cite and follow in his pioneering work, and you discuss the empirical theological cycle that he pioneered and proposed, which is nothing other than a more richly understood theological approach to see, judge, act. I'm not about to ask specific questions in all these areas. I'm here rather to ask that you would offer us a reflection in any one of those dimensions that you might find to be most helpful not only for understanding your work in this wonderful text, but in understanding what might lead your work moving forward as acting rector.
Well, what was important to me, and part of the reason I went with that method as we were trying to do different things, it's interesting, as you mentioned Catholic Action, coming back to my own parents, they were very active in Catholic Action in Cuba in the 1950s. We think that whole sense of the laity being involved was an invention of the council. Obviously, the council was very much a fruit of a lot of that. And the importance of being able to look at both, make that connection with the theological tradition, which Vanderbilt would allow and encourage, and to be able to use quantifiable data. The importance of research that is looking at data, and to be able to bring those together in attempting to then make plans for the future. Those were, for me, the elements that were attractive to me. My life has always been one of bridging, and in a sense we've had this conversation. I wanted to use the methods to accomplish a purpose. I wasn't one. I was not there as a deeply ingrained and committed practical theologian. I'm going to use this method and stick to it point by point. But that method attracted me again because of being able to connect with the tradition, using data to be able to make judgments that were helpful to the church for the future. And certainly I was acting as a student who was a doctoral student who was also a seminary faculty member who wanted to address very specific questions.
I'd like to add how deeply edified I was, and I'm sure all the readers of this text will be, about the connection between a method that engages action and experience in the world with the same focal point you brought and you bring to the theology of priesthood, as active and engaged in the world in ministry of service to the people of God, and that the fatherhood of the priest is by serving as father to those whom he's called to serve, rather than merely as an honorific. I find this throughout your work, and as part of what makes your work so extraordinary and exceptional, that you are able to engage deeply in questions of method and methodology, profound questions in theology, including sacramental theology, as well as, of course, sacrament of orders, but how you then take it to the very specific and very concrete questions. I'd like to now ask that you might simply provide for all of us a brief description of those 5 areas. I'll simply name them one at a time. And I'd like to ask that, first of all, you might simply describe these, and then we'll go ahead and discuss a little bit more about how these 5 come out in your research. But first of all, let's just name them. Could you tell all of us a little bit more about clinical pastoral education, its history, and how it's practiced or utilized in a number of different seminaries around the country?
One interesting thing about all of these, and I saw it specifically with regards to clinical pastoral education, or CPE, is that I found in my research that there have been very little, they all call for theological reflection in one way or another, but there has been very little theological reflection at the level of seminary faculties or of vocation offices that I can tell about why we choose to use them. And something that they have in common is that they're all programs that, with an asterisk that I'll get to, are all optional. They're programs that a seminary or a diocese, or in some cases a seminarian himself, can say, I want to do this in addition to, or we want to have you do this in addition to the seminaries program. So that sort of framed the conversation. What with these programs, how do we decide whether to use this one or that one in a reality where money and time are factors in terms of what's available there for a particular seminarian to do. So clinical pastoral education has been around for a long time, since the 1920s, and it comes from a Protestant experience, certainly. And really going back to the 1960s, as there was that desire to have pastoral experiences, but at the same time to have that experience of looking at the life of the seminarian and what's happening inside him as he's having these experiences. That this program, which had been focused primarily in hospitals, but also been used in prison ministry, had been used in psychiatric institutions. I think that's where it began. Mm-hmm. There was that desire to have seminarians take part in these programs. Again, one of the earliest, there's a doctoral dissertation from the early 1980s that looked at this program specifically and said, Catholic seminaries just haven't asked the question, why should we use it? And so as I looked at the program, that was one of the things that it is the program that many seminarians across the country love to hate. Many have very difficult experiences. Many seminaries used to require it for everybody. Far fewer do now. And again, I wanted to ask the question, what impact does this have?
Father, I'm sorry to interrupt, but could you briefly describe what CPE would typically involve for a seminarian participating in it?
Okay. Usually it could be a part-time, but normally it's a summer experience, 8 to 10 weeks in a hospital, being involved in regular ministry. But one of the elements is a lot of verbatims and a lot of discussion about, well, what really was happening inside you as you were having this encounter, and working with the different teammates. One of the positives can be getting to know the people on your team and really value their experiences. They're coming from different faith experiences. A challenge sometimes can be if the supervisor doesn't value the Catholic understanding of ministry of presence, sacramental ministry, and so that's where, depending on the locations, there have been very varied experiences.
And just before we move on, that word verbatim that you use can mean so much for CPE, but not everyone hearing this might know what verbatims mean. Can you give us some insight in terms of why verbatims are so central for CPE and what they are? It's basically, you've had an encounter and you write out and say, okay, I just had this interview with Bryan Froehle for an hour, and these are all the things that he said, and I said this, and then I felt this when he said this, and I thought it's those kinds of again, what happened and what are you reading that happened in between the lines, and then you present this to the group that is your cohort, and everybody's. I haven't done it, so I'm not sure. It depends on the program. You say, "Oh, Alfredo is so wonderful," or you really should have gotten at this, and so. Thank you very much. I'd now like to move on to something that is in fact mandated and described in the PPF, the Program of Priestly Formation. I'm referring here to the notion of the spirituality or propaedeutic year. And I'm wondering if you could describe that a little bit and how things work out for seminarians, perhaps using an example of St. Vincent de Paul Regional Seminary. Well, actually, this program is, the new PPF will have it. It's not in the current Program of Priestly Formation, but the new PPF, based on the Ratio Fundamentalis, the Roman document saying this is what seminaries across the world are supposed to have, is going to call for a propaedeutic year, a year of focus primarily on
spiritual growth, catechetic, sort of the basic theological background or content, and really getting to be accustomed to life in common and the sense of giving of oneself completely and some more detachment from the world. In the United States, really, only 2 seminaries have had it in full. And they're, the first place where it was run was actually Philadelphia. Mm-hmm. And I believe it was in the late 80s when it started. They ran it for several years, and then it stopped.
Right.
Denver, Archbishop Chaput, started in their seminary when it was founded. And then when he became Archbishop of Philadelphia, he brought it back to Philadelphia. An aside, obviously in any kind of research, how you ask questions has a role to play. I'm pretty convinced that some of the people who said they had a spirituality year in my survey didn't, which affects the data. But that's the idea, is again having that year of preparation. The Holy See has been very clear that whatever we do in the States as we prepare to implement this, they really do want this to happen. The practicalities of how it's going to happen, if it's a college seminary, if somebody's coming into theology, pre-theology, that's in the works right now. And until Rome says that this document that the bishop sent over has been approved, we're still in something of a waiting pattern, but it seemed appropriate. Before the ratio came out, I already planned to include this, and then the ratio came out, I said, oh, this is pretty important.
Very fortuitous indeed that you included it. And it's interesting to note how this has been consistently emphasized as part of this international and really global conversation within the church in terms of formation of priesthood. I'd like to move on now to something that arguably has emerged a bit more within seminaries in the US and a little bit less so internationally. And that, of course, is the pastoral year internship. Please.
And that idea that there's supposed to be strong, and the new ratio and the PPF call for pastoral experiences. What I think has been the insight of the United States is that having a lengthy pastoral internship before the commitment to priesthood is made, before ordination to the diaconate, that's key. And so what our seminary would have would be, after second year of theology, the seminarians would maybe that summer do something like CPE. We've actually, since my research, we've taken it off as a requirement, but have some kind of experience that summer, and then do a 10-month internship in a parish where you really get a chance to live with priests and at the same time be involved in all the different kinds of ministry. And what I have found to be key, and I'm giving a little bit of a spoiler alert, but one of the things that in our research I found was very important to distinguish are seminaries that, in a sense, allow for pastoral year if the diocese wants it. Now the guy goes to the parish and we'll see what happens, and then they come back. And seminaries for whom it is a key part of the formation, and where the diocese is aware of what's going on, and if there's a problem, can tell the vocations director or the bishop, you might want to move this guy. And I think the differences, as I read the comments behind some of the responses, it was pretty clear which ones were one and which were the other. Where it was a part of formation, it was a much more helpful part of the process for those guys.
Thank you very much. It's a critical aspect to be able to understand the importance of the pastoral year. I've had the privilege of being involved in research in terms of priesthood formation going back, I suppose, some 25 years. And I can remember back in the 90s, the discussion about just where that pastoral year should be placed. And it seemed to me that where it's placed right in the middle of, let's say, a 5-year period of study or program of study as a pivot point, then it has a very different role than if it's done towards the very beginning or later on. If it's done before the possibility or before diaconal ordination has occurred, it also has an impact. So before we move forward, I'm wondering if you could maybe share a little bit of your thoughts about the role in terms of the pivot that the pastoral year offers and the degree to which that sometimes is reflected in programs of study and sometimes less so.
Right. And that's, in our experience, it is normally after second theology. Earlier, one, the seminarian has less to offer. And so there's less reason for a pastor to want him for that long. And he isn't at that point of making that commitment yet. The danger of when I was a seminarian, we would have a 7-month internship, but it was right at the beginning of the last year of theology, and then we were ordained deacons at the end. You basically just slid into ordination to the diaconate. What we found is doing it before third theology allows the guys to come back to us after that year. And we say, you need to really be, certainly that doesn't mean the sermon has stopped, that it's a done deal. But you need to be ready to say, this is forever. And I'm ready to move into third theology with that commitment in my heart. And that really allows that discernment. And then they come back and we're able to reflect with them on that experience as they make the commitment for good. And so we've had some cases, in particular men who need more time in the beginning because of language. We've had cases where we will shorten the internship to 7 months and make it be spring and summer of that third year. But then they still have that year to come back. So for me, the key, and really, I think that's sort of the way I framed even the question in the research. The key isn't, is it 10 months? Is it a full 2 semesters? But is it at that time? That's allowing them to have had sufficient time in a parish and then to come back with that time of reflection, of experience, to then, with a presumption that they're moving on towards ordination, to then enter that third year and be prepared to discern with the church. Then we sometimes call the work that the formation team does in the seminary the work of the father-in-law. Can we say yes? Can we be happy with your marriage to our daughter, the church?
So very helpful. I really appreciate how you bring in this pivoting, that in fact the pastoral year can often, although not always, be, and how you relate this at some level to the inspired focus of your work that goes back that joyful faithfulness and formation for whom. I would like to ask you just one more question before we move forward about the pastoral year. Could you give our listeners some sense of how a particular parish or pastor in a particular parish might be selected to receive a particular seminarian, and what the typical seminarian would expect or would experience over that period of time of that pastoral year?
That's the piece that is it's out of our control directly, because the bishop and vocation directors make that decision in each diocese. But we encourage them to pick parishes that are active, that have, if possible, have a school or a strong religious education program, and a lot of different ministries that are going to challenge the seminarians. We're a bilingual seminary, so that are going to challenge them to work in English and Spanish if they've got those skills or developing those skills. And a priest who is himself joyful in ministry, and who is going to be a good model and be able to have, we're not looking, and it wouldn't be real to have every parish be Bing Crosby, and I don't remember who the name.
I was at the Bells of St. Mary's. I was thinking the same thing, Father.
We're not pretending that, but it should be something that's going to be a good model of what rectory life should be like.
Yeah.
And so that they can have someone who is going to support them and encourage them. And again, that's where our role as formation team, as faculty, is very important to be able to be in close. We're in contact with them regularly during the course of the year. It's not, again, as I said, not something that's done apart from the seminary.
So just to finish up on that, that would mean that your hope might be that over the course of those 10 months, that the seminary would be assigned, say, to be engaged in different ministries almost sequentially throughout the parish, or in some orderly manner to be exposed to all areas of parochial life and ministry?
Yes. And they also, for us, they're also doing some classes during the course of the year. There's an online class in the fall on catechetics, and catechesis and evangelization that includes work on sort of being able to examine and understand the ministry of the parish, the different ministries of the parish. Of course, on parish administration in the spring. They come to the seminary really or virtually, depending on how the year is running. Usually they would come back twice during the year for workshops.
And Father Hernández, I certainly want to applaud the outstanding curriculum and curricular work that's characteristic of St. Vincent de Paul Regional Seminary, including its historic and remarkable bilingual focus, for which you and your own ministry bring so much. So I want to thank you for that, and I think that it's helpful for us all to be aware of those remarkable contributions. But now I need to move on to ask about another dimension, that of priestly fraternity groups. Now, obviously, seminarians are not themselves already ordained priests, but I'd like you to share a little bit about what you mean by this aspect of formation activities.
We wanted to look at whether having activities such as one program that many priests belong to is Jesus Caritas, which is focused on the spirituality of Blessed Charles de Foucauld. And many priests have found that having support from other priests is key to their perseverance in joyful ministry. And some seminaries have for many years had Jesus Caritas groups for seminarians. Others have adapted them in various ways. We have something here called Emmaus Nights or Emmaus Meetings, where again a group of seminarians will do something like what Jesus Caritas does: a review of life, a time of prayer together, just being able to listen to each other and without getting into criticizing and you should have done that, just knowing that they're holding each other accountable. And so kind of what interested me was does having this kind of program in seminary support future perseverance in ministry, but in a particular way, does it encourage and strengthen the possibility that they will in fact stay involved in those kinds of programs later, which will then be helpful. And so again, spoiler alert, because I'm not sure how far we'll get, but we didn't find like a whole lot of correlation of, hey, this is like the activity that is going to help in all different kinds of areas. But it is correlated with saying, if I did this in seminary, I'm more likely to be in this kind of group later as a priest. And if it does that, then it did what it was supposed to do.
Absolutely. And let me add that a few years ago, I was privileged to lead one of, at that time, I suppose it was the first ever random sample telephone survey of priests, national, fully representative. And there were two factors that accounted for the joyful experience, that joyful perseverance of the diocesan priest. One was the sense of being understood by his bishop. Does his bishop understand and support him? And the second was, does he have close friends who are priests with whom he can pray? Very, very simple. Everything else fell out besides those two elements. And I realize, Father Hernández, that you have very little control over just who the bishop will be and how the bishop may or may not lead. But you have everything to do with forming the men for rich relationship with each other eventually as priests, to be able to develop and deepen those relationships of prayer and support. So let me simply say how moved I was by that aspect of your inclusion of this in your research, given how critical it is around the country in data that is out there. I'd like to move now to the very last aspect. If you could just briefly describe for all of us the role of the Institute for Priestly Formation, which I fully understand could take several hours of interview on its own. But just a few words about that before we then go to your findings.
And this was a program that was established at Creighton University back in the 1990s, really looking to see what could be done to strengthen the spiritual formation, in particular, and the discernment, the capacity to discern of diocesan seminarians. And they have a variety of programs, but I specifically was looking at their summer institute. I'll just to be very honest, if I had a dog in the fight going into this, I really wanted to show how effective pastoral year was. The impact of IPF, as it's commonly called, the long-standing, the over years impact of IPF on the guys who took part in that experience blew me out of the water. It really is just a very, very positive experience. Again, getting ahead of myself, I think one of the elements that allows it to have that experience is that it is one program that controls the inputs and the outputs. At the very least, they control the inputs. I use the image of the franchise effect. It's not a restaurant that's been franchised out. They do in fact have one program in a couple of different places sometimes, but the Summer Institute, they're great, and they're able to say, hey, this is what we're doing, and they're able to offer a good product that clearly, at least for the guys who took part in this in the mid 2000s, was able to help them to be successful in ministry for the next decade and change.
And now, Father Hernández, we're of course jumping to this very concluding aspect that you've helped us move into so very well. Because after all, what you're suggesting in your research, if I'm hearing it correctly, is that the investment in clear program that can work well for all, whereby there is an element of quality every step of the way, that may well exist at many places for the pastoral year, but is not always the case in every parish, in every assignment, nor does any one seminary have a particularly strong voice in any of those assignments. And in the case of the clinical pastoral education, CPE, one's looking at something that is fundamentally as useful as it may be from outside the Catholic pastoral formation or priestly formation world, and therefore may not necessarily be able to have those elements that IPF or any strong, highly invested, very clear program designed to work from beginning to end might have. the spirituality or propaedeutic year may well bring in some similar concerns, one might imagine, as was the case historically, in different applications, in different ways, and even what those who were experiencing were thinking they were experiencing. Which takes us back to the final question, really. Could you describe for us not only your overall conclusions, which you've already hinted at in so many wonderful ways, but could you also correlate it with your vision of priestly perseverance that is ultimately about that focus on the people of God? Because seminarian perseverance is about priestly perseverance, is about that perseverance in the call to serve the people of God. If you could just briefly speak to this, it would be wonderful, Father.
Okay. If I may indicate the question that I asked that I was not able to answer, because what I had hoped to do had been to be able to ask the question, is there a correlation between having taken part in these formation activities, and can I relate that to those who persevered in ministry and those who left ministry after sometime within the first 10 years. And in the end, not enough responded who had left ministry. Won't get into all the ways I tried to get the research, get at it, but not enough responded to be able to make that correlation. However, we were able, I mentioned this briefly before we started, that we were able to get Kara, which you know very well as you ran the program for a number of years. Kara has a survey each year of priests being ordained, men leaving formation, and they added questions. Did you take part in these programs in seminary? To their survey, and that will allow some longitudinal work to be done in the future, hopefully, making some of those correlations, I would hope. But saying that, having said that, what we found was that the IPF certainly had the strongest positive correlation, and with the variety of different areas that we looked at, questions really relating to what each of these programs is trying to accomplish, but overwhelmingly the highest and actually someone who helped me to look at the data was my own nephew who works in marketing, and there's something called the Net Promoter Score that they ask in terms of if would you be likely to recommend us to your friends, and he helped me to adapt that marketing language to the net impact score, kind of taking out the people in the middle, comparing the negatives to the highest positives, and the strongest positive impact was associated certainly with IPF overall, the Institute of Priesthood Formation. Interestingly, am I going to be be involved in some kind of priesthood support group? Wow, not at all surprisingly, being involved in something like Jesus Caritas or Emmaus was involved. Did I learn the kinds of skills that I need for ministry? Did I learn about how important it is to be involved in a good rectory and getting the support of a good pastor, etc.? Pastor year was very much connected with that. Kind of learning to pray, the basics of prayer, spirituality would have been connected to that. So those elements, and quite frankly, I think in part because it's of the danger of not being connected to the mission of the seminary directly. Those programs would be most disconnected from that. Obviously, CPE being clearest, being a negative. That said, again, I think places where dioceses have good relationships with. Don't want to throw out the possibility of using CP at all, but where there's a very good relationship with the hospital where CP is done, where you know the theory and theology, and you're able to be involved with, and it's not just at random throwing them to a supervisor who doesn't understand what we're about. And I think that's really part of it's one of the other images that I use, is that are we working with a common view of what we want to accomplish? And that's something we're pretty clear as a formation faculty. Let's take, coming back to the example of pastory that we think is so important for us in our program. When we see and we're getting the word, this is not working out, and maybe this bishop has used this pastor before, and now we're hearing these kinds of reports a second time. We have a responsibility to talk to the bishop or the vocation director and say, look, this is not a good place for you to send your seminarians. Please don't do that again. And if it's really bad, we need to change this now, because it's affecting what you want us to help this guy to accomplish. So those are some of the results, and it really did show that these kinds of programs can have a significant impact, not just on what happens in seminary, but what happens long term. And something your own, and it all leads to a question that is very challenging for us to look at, is what is the impact of our work as seminary? Mm-hmm. As you found many years ago in your own work, it has long been difficult for seminaries and for bishops and for priests to talk about where we haven't succeeded. Mm-hmm. And no one likes to get bad news. That said, if we really care about the work that we're doing, and we think it matters for seminarians to come out prepared to be ordained to the diaconate and into the priesthood from our seminaries, then we need to be open and honest about the data, because we can't say that we run a data-driven operation and that we care about what our results have been if we're not willing to be open and transparent about them. And that was really one of the challenges. I would have, when we talked about this, I would have wanted to have done something really that would have been a much simpler study to do in terms of, hey, how did your seminary have these programs, and what's your rate of success in helping guys remain in ministry? It was clear that we really didn't want to talk about that. And so, but again, I think it's the National Association of Catholic Theological Schools that has encouraged CARA to do some research to help us to see where we succeeded. And I'm looking forward, that's actually been done recently. I'm looking forward to seeing those results. And again, as I said, I think even expanding the work of that survey of ordinands is going to be very helpful looking into the future, so that we're, in a sense, gathering information here that'll help us to carry it forward and say, see how I did it visually? Carry it forward and say, these are the programs that helped guys to succeed.
Really appreciate that, Father. You have always in your ministry and in your leadership at St. Vincent de Paul Regional Seminary brought in this focus on having these open and honest conversations, but always mediated by this long, loving gaze, on the one hand, to the actual data and the actual experience. And I have to just applaud your work for the research rigor that it reflects. the degree to which you state conclusions that you can draw, and you're able to work with suggestive findings as well for the service of the church. And the way you take an addition from that long, loving gaze to the depth of theological insight on which you therefore build in your own work. Your work on formation has, in my estimation, added considerably not only to what we know about priestly formation, but also indeed about the theology of priesthood itself. That comes from the doing as much as the being. That comes from the focus towards the people of God and the perseverance to which one is called, in which one becomes formed, precisely as you're describing. Those kinds of outcomes coming from that kind of focus in a man's experience in formation. As we look at concluding this conversation, I'm wondering if there might be any final words you might like to share, perhaps even a word from yourself before July 1st, when you've now become the acting rector, to a word to yourself or to others who might be called across this country or indeed around the world to this critical ministry of seminary rector. What might your thoughts in this regard be as we look towards concluding?
Well, clearly we are living and we haven't addressed it, and yet it is the reality in which we live in a moment in the church and in the world of great turmoil and crisis. And certainly we have been. As I was finishing my research, the 2018 scandal 3.0 or 4.0 hit. And then as the book was being prepared for publication, the coronavirus, and then certainly the summer discontent in the midst of that hit. And yet in all of this, we're called to prepare seminarians who are able to give themselves as loving fathers to their people. And again, fatherhood of self-giving. I'll say something, and I really was struck as we were one of the few seminaries that was able to, in part because of our physical location, our open campus, but at the same time we're able to close, but where there's a lot of space for movement, we were able to stay open through the lockdown. And so really something that my now former rector, Bishop-elect David Toops, used that expression a number of times, of how it really called the seminarians to have that awareness of our being one of the largest praying communities in the country, if not the world, during those months. And in that time, I had a deep awareness of the need to be, of my call to be, as I prayed for these seminarians that we were praying together in the chapel, that call to fatherhood for myself. And I really think that sense led me to then prepare to take on this fatherly role now as rector. And so that's got to be at the bottom of, do we love the men we're working with to then help them to love the people of God that they're preparing to serve?
I cannot imagine a more providential space for us to conclude. This space of love that comes from joyful faithfulness that in turn has reflected that vocational call. Thank you very much, Father Alfredo Hernández, St. Vincent de Paul Regional Seminary.
Thank you, Bryan.
Hello, God's beloved. I'm Annabelle Mosley, author, professor of theology, and host of Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. I invite you to listen in and find inspiration along this sacred journey we're traveling together to make our lives a masterpiece and, with God's grace, become saints. Join me, Annabelle Mosley, for Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. God bless you. Remember, you're never alone. God is always with you.
To a production of WCAT Radio. Please join us in our mission of evangelization, and don't forget, love lifts up where knowledge takes flight.